So, any of you read Harari before? Which ones had you read? All of them, or?
No, just the book that you're...
Oh, this one, okay, yeah. Yeah, so there's, in the beginning, I think at chapter 2, he summarizes Sapiens. Sapiens was the first book, and that was the big, the very, and it's still in print all the time. You could, it's in print at any airport bookstore. If you, you want to read Sapiens, you forgot to pack reading material for a flight, they have it there, and really all over the world. Is read in every language, so it's incredible. And what Sapiens is it's you can see that because the charts that he puts on them out, they're clearly like this was his PowerPoint when he's teaching the course. But that made the big, he got made famous with that. And one of the things that I remember about Sapiens is that he says that the most successful species to have ever to live on the planet is he gives, I forget what it is, it's the scientific term for wheat. Because wheat has enslaved humans over the millennia, and it has humans working to water them, to feed them, to take care of them, that it just convinced humans to enslave, and they are spread throughout the entire world, and more successful than any other species on Earth, which is, and that's what's great about Harari, that he forces us to, or challenges us to think about things in different ways, than we had thought about it before. One of the main points about Sapiens, yeah, it's low battery. I'll have to do it to here. It's down to 10%. That's why. Yeah, that was the same problem from the concert, that the battery went out and it was never replaced here. So okay. So then he wasn't specifically interested in the futuristic stuff. His field is actually as a medieval historian, but he did this, this broad sweep. But whereas *Sapiens* was a history of the human species, his next book, which is *Homo Deus*, he calls it a history of the future, when he prognosticates about challenging developments. And then he became sort of one of the public intellectuals that got to speak a lot about AI and different dangers there. And there's the passage in this book when he said, I wrote *Homo Deus* in was it 2016, and a lot of the things I said and happened, it's even worse today. And then there was a book that had come out then a few years later. I think it came out about 6 years ago, called 21 Questions for the 21st Century. And if you just want to get short synopsis of what he says about anything, you can get that book, and they're just 21 little essays, and you can read them independently. They sort of build one against the other, but it gives you a snapshot. So if you want a lighter Harari than this, it's shorter and lighter in style. You can get that in 21 Questions for the 21st Century. And it's also nice because he sort of summarizes what his viewpoints are. But he does at the beginning of this book too. So we'll get into that. What I thought was particularly interested in this book, a number of things, why I thought that we should spend some time talking about Nexus. And one reason is that he looks phenomenologically at a lot of the current issues that we're facing with in our society. So it's a way to look at it, but rather than from a political perspective, to sort of take a step back, and say what are the ingredients of what's going on, so we can understand sort of where the world is, what a populist movement is, and understand it sort of in the broader context. You don't come out feeling any better about it, probably come out feeling worse, but at least we have the benefit of a broader perspective. The other thing that I was excited about this book is it was the first of all, because I've read his other books, and it was the first one where he really talks about being an Israeli and being a Jew, which he doesn't come up in any other books. In *Sapiens*, when he talks about religion, it's all Buddhism, which is sort of to be expected from a secular Israeli, right? And so let me say a word about the nature of religion in Israel. It's much more polarized than here. Right, so in Israel, in the Jewish population, there's a divide. You're either secular or you're religious, which means Orthodox, right? The type of Jews that we are, which is the mainstream in America, is an anomaly in Israel. There are Reform and conservative congregations in Israel, but they haven't made I think slowly making a gradual impact on the society, but it's a very small sector of Israelis that come into contact with non-Orthodox Judaism, right? So, and so often Israelis who are looking for something spiritual, they're trained to be, because they're born in Israel, they're trained to be allergic to Judaism. So we have a lot of Israelis who look at Buddhism, and that's of interest to Israelis. It's also, Thailand is like one of the top places for, it's a part of Israeli culture. When you finish the army, you leave Israel, because it's very, why finish the army, right? You're in school, you're a kid, then you go to the army after high school, and then you're free. So you leave the country, you go travel in the world, and Thailand's one of the top places for, there are whole Israeli resorts in Thailand where everyone speaks Hebrew, and, and they sort of know which ones to go to there. So it's expected that he would talk about Buddhism, which he does a lot in Sapiens. In this book, it's more, he does a lot more on Christianity and Judaism, and specifically on Judaism and on being Israeli, and so it sort of opens up, and I was thrilled that he was engaging that, which I felt was missing from his earlier works. I think a lot of his understanding, I agree with most of the stuff that he says, except when he writes about religion, where I disagree. Probably because it's my expertise. I mean, if my field was AI, I'm sure I would take issue with some of the things that he says there. Not knowing anything about that beyond just living in the world, I kind of have to trust his explanations, and I go with his analysis. So that's sort of my overview here. So I had asked, let me ask, because we started before when we started, did any of you read Harari before this book? Read Sapiens? It was the Sapiens book, I'm assuming. Which one? You read 21 Questions. But not 21 times. Okay, yeah, well, that you can do piecemeal, that's what I said. And you read which one? The Sapiens, yeah. Sapiens is a great book. There's a graphic novel version? Or graphic version? That's interesting, because as it is, there's a lot of pictures in it. And you have to, if you want to buy, you have to make sure which one to buy, because the cheaper mass production is in black and white, but the earlier printings are all in glossy paper in color, so the pictures are all in color. So if you want to buy Sapiens and are looking in the library or either Amazon, look for the earlier edition so you have it in color. So you can take more in. And but I didn't see the graphic one. I'll take a look for that. Yeah. Nexus is harder. Yeah, it is harder. Yeah. I don't care if he's an atheist or not. I agree I don't agree. It's not up to me to agree or disagree with his religiosity. That's his business, right? What I'm saying is I don't think he presents it properly. I think he misunderstands religion. So we'll talk about that when we go through it. Yeah. Okay, so this is, as I said, a bit harder. I mean, I'll go through a few things. I'd like today to get through chapter 2. So go through, and then, but if others, if there are other things, and if you're reading it, and, I say this with when I teach rabbinical students also, I teach history class, I say, mark something in the margin or something, and then if I don't bring it out, you can shout it out, and we'll talk about it, like in any kind of, book discussion, and I'll bring up the points that that I'm flagging, that I think are worth talking about a bit more. And yeah, it is a heavier read, but we'll digest it and we'll get through it, because I think it's a very important voice. You see Harari occasionally in opinion pieces, in different papers and newspapers, and it's also an important, because he's coming from the liberal Israeli academia perspective. It's an important perspective because it's a very leftist perspective that the broader lefter world doesn't listen to. Because if you come from Israel, they dismiss you as colonialist, imperialist, Zionist, and then your voice is canceled out, which is ironic because the Israeli academic is one of the most leftist, radical voices in the broader academic world. So that's part of the, the irony there. So he's, and also he is openly gay as well. He refers to his husband in his bio. So that also, be open about that makes it clear that he has no traction with the Orthodox, religiously identifying Jewish community in Israel. So that's clear from the start, so we know what his background is. Okay, so in the prologue on Roman numeral 14, he has 3 lines when he says the main argument of the book. Right? When you find that, it's like, that's exciting, because then, then if I don't understand, he's trying to say this, so I know what he's trying to say. The main argument of the book is that humankind gains enormous power by building large networks of cooperation, but the way these networks are built predisposes us to use that power unwisely. Our problem then is a network problem. Even more specifically, it is an information problem. So that's why he's focusing on information networks. So that's what he's focusing on. That's what his narrowing fees. And it comes from one of the pieces in *Sapiens*, which is his history of the human species. He says, what is it that allowed humans to surpass other animals and succeed in all the things that we've succeeded in, for better or for worse, right? And he says the answer is be able to work cooperatively in larger groups, right? And that's the leap that humans are able to do that other species have. And it's arguable, right? And there are the biologist, Edwin Wilson, right, who died a couple years ago. He spent his whole career talking about the ant society and how ants had thousands, working and managed to work together and cooperatively. And he addresses that. And he says, humans, you can have more than ants, even more. Right? And he talks about, there's over 1.4 billion people living in China. There's 1.4 billion affiliates of the Roman Catholic Church. Those are more than any ant colony. So it still exponentially passes ants. But that's his nod to Wilson, and other biologists that might say, humans aren't the only species that can act cooperatively. Okay, so, and then one of the main points in this book that he first introduces in the prologue at Roman numeral 15, and then he goes on and he cracks it, he chisels through this idea more and more through the book, is what he calls the naive view of information. And this is probably the original argument that he's making through this book, that he says that we used to think, or most people think, that prejudice is a function of ignorance. Right, and that if we would just educate people more, then they wouldn't hold erroneous views. So, for example, racism, right? He said if we would, if we would just educate them about biology and anthropology, and they understand that race is not a scientific concept, then they would not have prejudice that certain people are more superior and others are inferior. So it's just a matter of education. And that's, when he doesn't address this, it's often the argument about Holocaust education. And we always say, it's often argued that the antidote to anti-Semitism is to mandate Holocaust education. It's been the approach in New Jersey for years. And so he's saying that that doesn't necessarily get you to where you need to go, right? Just giving people information doesn't change their attitudes. And that's what he calls, so he calls that the naive view of information. Because the fact is that we have more information available to people than at any time in history, exponentially greater than ever before. I mean, there's the one line that he says that there's more information in here than the ancient library of Alexandria, right? So more than any human could have ever imagined to have is just in here. So, and then why is that the case? And he doesn't, it takes him a while through the book to kind of chisel away and explain why that is, like why more information doesn't make people better people, make them more ethical, more moral. And the main thrust of the argument, and he's laying this out in the prologue, is that information is weaponized. That you build a network where you're selectively sending the information that you want in order to weaponize, to build a society that you're weaponizing, right? I want to get people to follow me, so I'm going to feed them this. And you feed them that, and then it gets people riled up. And that will then, and that will cause terrible things to happen. I mean, there's later in the book, and when he talks about technology, which we'll get to after he covers the historical stuff, it's that where you had, he says, massacres were caused by algorithms feeding one side more, the most radical, hate-filled speech is the ones that people will listen to, because those are featured more, because they get clicked more, because they're more interesting than the more moderate voices. So then that will elevate one perspective and one emotion that will get people to commit terrible things. And he talks about that. He gives in the prologue, he mentions Nazi Germany as another example, right? He says that it wasn't because individuals were more evil or different than other people at any other time. It was because of the way that the Nazi state had siphoned information and given one view out, that was able to organize societally a network that served at the will of the leadership. So that's this, that's what he's going to explain, and that's the danger of an information network, that it actualizes or mobilizes, in a sense, people towards, and can weaponize people in that sense. Okay, and that's a scary viewpoint, right? Because we've always kind of got the sense that if we would just educate people properly, would make the right decisions, right? One of the arguments for compulsory public education is that you need educated people if they're going to vote responsibly, right? So that if there's universal suffrage, then there has to be universal education. And then if people take social studies classes and they learn civics, then they'll make responsible decisions, right? So, and nevertheless, there are plenty of examples, don't only have to look at the current day, where you have a population that is more educated universally than the past, but voted in surprisingly or irrational ways, right? And also, if we look at Nazi Germany, that always, it always, to this day, right, it's still, because that's more my field in German history, that how many Nazis and how many perpetrators had doctorates, and were highly educated people. So that kind of goes to what Harari is arguing, right? That education is not necessarily a prophylactic against prejudice, and that's a very chilling perspective, and then important to look at why that is. He's not saying that we shouldn't educate people, but he's saying that we have to understand how information is passed on, and then once he diagnoses the problem, then we can talk about how we can do so more responsibly. I mean, even today, one of the opinion pieces in just this morning's opinion section in the New York Times was saying which party will take action against concerns about AI and will protect us from the dangers of AI. So this is a very, very current, and the way that AI fits in is important, and you'll later in the book and get there in terms of how it siphons the information and because we tend to trust, there's a trust, this is the information that I need, this is the data that I need, and whether that's the right data or the right information or not. So that's what I wanted to say about the prologue. So I'm going to focus more on the first two chapters. Again, interrupt me at any time. Just a reminder, I'm always going to start sharply at 9:30 because I have a Hebrew high school class at 10:30. So we got that later. So, and if I don't necessarily have time for Q&A, that's why don't hesitate to interrupt. If there's too many interruptions, I'll just ignore you, so that's okay. Okay, so chapter 1 is what is information, and then he's going to talk about stories in chapter 2, and then documents, which will have a lot to say, which is written text in chapter 3, and errors in chapter 4. So starting with the section on what, he's describing sort of what information is. And he has this great passage about this bird, right, which is Jeremy, which is the carrier pigeon from World War I, that there was a American battalion that was surrounded by enemy positions in World War I, so they sent the pigeon to tell the right? But then there's the context, so that in terms of whether you have all the information, all depends on your perspective. So he talks about, when he's talking about World War I, he then does this great shift where he says World War I wasn't only fought on the Western Front, which is what we're most familiar with, which is in France and Belgium, which was where the front line was, but it was also fought in a lot of other places in the world, including the land of Israel. So he shifts there, and he talks about the first battle of Gaza, and the second battle of Gaza, and the third battle of Gaza. But these are conflicts going on in Gaza in 1917. 16 and 17, World War I. He's extremely aware that when he writes the Battle of Gaza, it will make us think about what's going on today, right? And but he puts that in again to give that sense of perspective. And that was when the whole area was a part of the Ottoman Empire, and the British are fighting against the Turks, who are the Ottomans. And then you have, there were Jews who were partisans basically behind Ottoman lines that were working to help the British, because the British were fighting against the Nazis. So any enemy of the Nazis is a friend of mine. So you had, and he talks about the Neely, which was this intelligence group of Jews who were trying to get information to the British in terms of how many Ottoman troops there were in Gaza, because the British were coming from Egypt and trying to breach the Ottoman lines into Israel through the Gaza Strip. And then one of the birds, and it's great because it's a correct comparison to the bird from the Western Front, because one of the pigeons makes a wrong turn and ends up in the courtyard of an Ottoman official. So, and then there was a code. He didn't understand the code, but he knew enough that this was information that shouldn't be going across the line. So, and they eventually found the group, and then it's this. He talks about Sarah Aronson, right, who was this famous Jew who took her own life so that she wouldn't give up information, were she arrested by the Ottomans, and then under torture would be forced to give information. And she's remembered as a pre-Israel hero in Israeli culture, who gave her life to protect her comrades and the British war effort against the Ottomans. So, and then when he says, although the Neely Brigade, the group are found and they're arrested, executed, or she took her own life, in the end, the British do prevail over the Ottomans. And then he puts in the Balfour Declaration when the British declare their support for the establishment of a Jewish home in Palestine. So it all, in the broader arc, she's successful, and that's why she's remembered as a hero. But then he says that depends on your perspective. From a Palestinian perspective, right, you can look at the same facts and tell the opposite story, right? And that these were traitors who betrayed the Ottoman, the Ottoman state, a result of which that Arabs were no longer under Arab sovereignty. Not that the Ottomans were Arabs, they're Turks, but still then but the point is, after World War I, they passed to colonial control, where they're occupied by the British and then by the Israelis, which is, from a Palestinian perspective, is just a continuation of the British occupation in terms of foreign European imperialists as opposed to the native Arab population. So he gives that example to show how here you're looking at the very same information from two opposite sides.
And that's just how information is subjective. And I also found it extraordinary because he's also writing it as an Israeli. So that's his story, right? And that's how his own story works into the broader canvas of the World War I history. So, okay, so that was a good, sort of Israeli-centered part of the story that he puts in there. And then when I go to page 12, he switches. So he talks about, so there's information that is factual. Like he said, you can debate whether or not Sarah Aronson was a hero or a traitor, but what you can't debate is that she died on October 9th, 1917. Right? So that's a fact, and then where you situate that fact and how you contextualize it is up to you. And that's why his perspective as an historian is so important and why I think so critical, because the job of the historian is not just to list facts, right? That to take an anti-AI perspective, a computer can list facts for you, right? What an historian does, an historian weaves it into a context and tells a story and figures out which facts are important, what to connect from this to this in order to tell a story. And that's what he's trying to get to, because he's getting to the idea of the importance of telling stories and how humans, when sapiens discovered how to tell stories, that's the leap forward, because animals don't tell stories, sapiens do. And that's what builds networks and communities, is the story that you tell. And those successful politicians, for better or for worse, are the ones who are able to tell simple, clear stories that excite people, So he then talks about other types of information, and he talks a bit about astrology. So he says, astrology, from a scientific perspective, is nonsense, right? Not everyone would agree with that. My view, okay. My view, probably his view. But nevertheless, it plays an important role in history because it influences, people, as it mentioned there. If you remember, I remember, the President of the United States is an astrologer that was Nancy's astrologer who would speak with Ronnie and and this is influencing decisions that are being made. But astrology goes way back, right? And we know, right? We had a talk recently about the zodiac in ancient synagogues, and it goes, the sense of the role of that. So he says though he writes about that, and then on page 12 he says the example of astrology illustrates. What it illustrates is that errors, lies, fantasies, and fictions are information too. And those are passed along because a zodiac reel is relaying information, right? And that's information, and it may be fictional, but it's still information, right? And contrary to what the naive view of information says, information has no essential link to truth. And its role in history is not to represent a pre-existing reality. Rather, what information does is create new realities by tying together disparate things, whether couples, like individuals, or empires, from the smallest to the broadest context. Its defining feature is connection rather than representation, and information was whatever connects different points into a network. So that's where he's using network technology, right? What information does is it connects 2 points, as this is relevant to this, and that's what tells a story, right? Connects things. Yeah. No.
About what you're saying right now in this part of the book is that we have micro networks and macro networks. And when I was thinking about what you just said,
Yeah.
as I was reading,
Yeah.
so a micro network is my individual family,
Mm-hmm.
and the information I get from my parents and how I'm brought up and what I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And I take that as information. Then my extended family, then my school, then my community, then
Right.
the world.
Right.
So it starts to get very layered and very complicated based on what you just
Right, and the way we define, and those are great examples, because the way from the smallest to the largest, but they're how we define the communities, and the communities define our identity, right? We identify ourselves in the context of our immediate family relations, but then through occupation, through professional networks, and then through civil society, through citizenship, through religion, through associations, right? There's all these different claims in our identity, and they interlock.
And not only that, when I read that part, I said to myself, we
Right.
We vehemently, so, no, I didn't grow up that way.
Right.
My parents didn't teach me that. No, I
Right.
don't believe you because of this.
Right.
And so we vehemently defend the information we have, whether it's fantasy or not.
Right. And except with the only exception of genetic descent, all of the other identity relationships are all fictional, right? They're created stories, right? What defines the difference between a New Jerseyan and a New Yorker, right? Or an American versus a Mexican, or a Jew versus a Christian, right? These are lines that we create, a Democrat versus a Republican.
Just turned to 2026.
Yeah,
Completely arbitrary.
exactly, right. So all of those associations are fictionalized based upon information and points that we connect. Exactly, right, right, right. Right. So let me now go where and this is where his anti-religious bias will come through here. So it comes through right on beginning on page 15. I didn't have to go further than that. So he says, it's the section called Information Human History. He writes, viewing information as a social nexus, that's what you're talking about, helps us understand many aspects of human history that confound the naive view of information as representation. It explains the historical success, not only of astrology, which is he's presenting as a fictional representations, because they're not real, but of much more important things, like the Bible, which is also a fictional narrative, he's arguing, right? So he says, while some may dismiss astrology as a quaint sideshow in human history, nobody can deny the central role the Bible has played. If the main job of information had been to represent reality accurately, it would have been hard to explain why the Bible became one of the most influential texts in history. And then he looks at the Bible from a literal perspective, and he says, the Bible makes many serious errors in its description of both human affairs and natural processes. The book of Genesis claims, and then he goes on and he lists, and he could have gone on and on, all the things in the representation of the prehistory of humanity or the evolution of the earth that Genesis presents that doesn't represent, he tries to be not too simplistic, right? He doesn't say in Genesis it says the world is created in 6 days, and we know it's not 6 days. He tries to be more sophisticated than that. He says the book of Genesis claims that all human beings, including, for example, the San people of the Kalahari Desert and the Aborigines of Australia, descend from a single family that lived in the Middle East about 4,000 years ago. Right? And he says, and that's just impossible. He talks about development of people from it. In fact, the ancestors of the San people lived in Africa for hundreds of thousands of years without ever leaving the continent. And the ancestors of the Aborigines settled in Australia more than 50,000 years ago. So saying the world is 5,800 years old and it comes from this family from the Middle East we just know that's not true. So he says Genesis has errors in it. It's errors, factual errors, and yet the Bible is the most influential story in the world. So it's not factual, and so, yes, right, if you look at the Bible, if you say the point of the Bible is to tell like a history or a geological history, an anthropological history, and then a geopolitical history, then it's not accurate, right? But if you understand the Bible as telling stories which create community among people, which Harari of all people should understand, because he's explaining the value of a story, then that's why it's effective, right? And that doesn't make it false, because it does build community, and it does teach the values of the community that holds it together. So that's sort of my first sense of where I had an issue with how he presents it, right? It's not what he does. If he doesn't want to see the Torah, so and Stace, to answer your question, if he doesn't want to see the Torah as holy and doesn't care about going to shul and hearing Torah reading, that's okay. It's his business. But to say that the Bible is erroneous and that's where he misunderstands the function of the Bible, I think he has blinders in a sense. Yeah. Right, which he does get lost in his look at Genesis, right. Right. Right.
Of a
Right.
society moving in
Right.
lockstep.
Right, and you understand why he gets lost in it, because he's living in a very polarizing society where the Orthodox, will believe literally what it says in the Bible. So, and the debates that we had in the 19th century over teaching evolution, in the public school, in schools, that's in Israel. You have two school systems. You have the religious school system, and you have the secular school system. And so the religious population only goes in the religious school system. So they don't learn, modern approach to science. And that's what he's contesting. So he says here, then go to page 16, and we're almost finished here with chapter 1. He says, while the Bible has done a poor job in representing the reality of human origins, migrations, and epidemics, it has nevertheless been very effective in connecting billions of people and creating the Jewish and Christian religion. So. Right. No, but then you'll see but hold on. That's true, right? It certainly has been successful that way. So he says, like DNA initiating chemical processes that bind billions of cells into organic networks, the Bible initiated social processes that bounded billions of people into religious networks. And just as a network of cells can do things that single cells cannot, so a religious network can do things that individual humans cannot, like building temples, maintaining legal systems. Yeah, not so great if you're on the out of that legal system, which he is as a gay Jew, right? The Orthodox interpretation of halakha does not accept his domestic relationship, right? And celebrating holidays, that's nice. Waging holy wars, not nice, right? And he ends the paragraph with waging holy wars, which he's criticizing all the major religions. It's the right-wing nationalists in Israel, it's Islamic terrorist actions, and it's the Crusades. It's all of it wrapped in together. He says all of this is a function of the spread of dangerous information.
He's defending his own information.
Correct.
Exactly what we said.
Yes.
He's in a circle.
Yes, because he is himself a Homo sapiens. Probably. That's why he's in that circle. Yes. So then I'll go to the end of the chapter when he says, when we look at the history of information from the Stone Age to the Silicon Age, and that's a nice alliterative phrase there, right? We therefore see a constant rise in connectivity without a concomitant rise in truthfulness or wisdom. And that's the shame, right? You always think that as we learn more, we become wiser. And his point is that having more information doesn't make you wiser. That was there was the sense in the 19th century, right, as you had the huge advances in science and understanding of the world. There was a sense of progress that humanity was, could solve every problem because we were just getting wiser and wiser. And then World War I comes, and this catastrophe, and all these advanced countries just destroy each other, and there's that, and there was that, and that's the 19th century is the optimistic century, and the 20th century is depressing. And then, in case you thought World War I was a blip, World War II is even worse, right? So that's sort of the story that he's arguing, right? That the spread of information doesn't make us wiser, contrary to what the naive view believes, Homo sapiens did not conquer the world because we are talented at turning information into an accurate map of reality. Rather, the secret of our success is that we are talented at using information to connect lots of individuals. Unfortunately, this ability often goes hand in hand with believing in lies, errors, and fantasies. This is why even technologically advanced societies like Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union have been prone to hold delusional ideas without their delusions necessarily weakening them. Indeed, the mass delusions of Nazi and Stalinist ideologies about things like race and class actually help them to make tens of millions of people march together in lockstep. So that's an important historical point that he's making there, because often people say, well, it's because the Soviet Union didn't practice open science, or because the Nazi Germany was blind because they had this racism problem, that's why both self-destructed. And he says, no, that's not why. In fact, their control and their spreading of fictions and delusions to help them achieve their power, and why they ended up not surviving is because of different issues. And he talks a lot about Nazism and Stalinism as we go through. But the comparison for today is clearly there as well. Yeah, Linda. Yeah, alternative facts and right and yeah. David.
In about 1890 or so, the famous physicist Rutherford said, "We know everything that there is to know." And 15 years later,
Right.
along comes Einstein, who turns it
Yeah.
upside down and inside
Right.
out.
Right. Right, and then you think about, the development of nuclear technology is a perfect example, right, where you have more information, and it didn't make the world safer, right? And that was that whole thing, Einstein and the whole, and then after him and the whole, that's exactly what he's talking about, right? That's a perfect. It's interesting he doesn't bring it up here, but it's another example. He does elsewhere. He talks about Oppenheimer a bit and the development of the bomb, but where there's just a sense that the more information we have, freedom of information, then everything will turn out well as long as we make information free and accessible. And that's and it's not necessarily, information and does not always help. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have free inquiry, right? But then that goes into the type of societies and how we govern information. Which he gets to later part of the book. All right, look, we got about 15 minutes, so I don't know if we'll get through all of chapter 2, but I'll start there. So and then he talks about stories, right? So that's the first step. So the first step in information networks is the ability to tell a story. Because even before he gets to the written word, that's the next chapter when he talks about text. So he says there, he starts saying, and this is the beginning is a summary of what he does this in more detail, especially in Sapiens. So if you could read it there, if you want, it spreads it out more. He says the ability of sapiens to cooperate flexibly in large numbers has precursors among other animals. Some social mammals, like chimpanzees, display significant flexibility in the way they cooperate, while some social insects, like ants, cooperate in very large numbers. That's the Wilson I was talking about. But neither chimps nor ants establish empires, religions, or trade networks. Sapiens are capable of doing such things because we are far more flexible than chimps and can simultaneously cooperate in even larger numbers than ants. In fact, there is no upper limit to the number of sapiens who cooperate with one another. The Catholic Church has 1.4 billion members. China has a population of 1.4 billion. The global trade network connects about 8 billion sapiens. So he's saying there's no limit, right? As long as you use the technologies of information, you can include more and more people. There's no upper limit to the maximum amount of people because of the ability to spread information that connects people, because of the information technologies. And this is surprising, given that humans cannot form long-term intimate bonds with more than a few hundred individuals. And this is the interesting thing, and he looks in anthropology to come up with this point. He says that a typical community is 20 to 60 members, and we're the same as chimpanzees and like bonobos in that sense, which are our closest relatives, right? I've said this before, but chimpanzees and bonobos are closer to humans than to orangutans or like gorillas, right? That's the split there. And like we call the higher apes, humans, chimpanzees, and like bonobos, we can get to know between 20 and 60 people. That's the optimum group. So that's a tribe, that's a clan. And that's the amount that in prehistoric times that humans would, Neanderthals would go around. It's 20 to 60 is the optimal size. They're people that everybody and you have a relationship with everyone. But the number on rare occasions might increase to between 150 to 200. But that's about it. 200 or a few hundred more, that's about the maximum of people that you can really know. That's why we say that Temple Israel is the ideal synagogue. Why is it the ideal synagogue? Because we have about 200 families. That's about the total number of people you could really know. So synagogues that are called mega synagogues, that have like 1,000 families, the problem with a mega synagogue is you walk into services and the people are going to be strangers. And you're not going to know them. And you can't, because just we're biologically incapable of having 1,000 friends. Like 200's the max. For most people, probably more like 50. Right? You have a ton of friends. You look through your friends in Facebook, how many are really friends, right? So, yeah, right. Joe is extraordinary. You probably know about 973 people, right? Very well, right? Right. Some people go through life not knowing more than 10 to 20 people, right? And that's fine. Right, because they're not really right. But that's the idea. It's between 10 and 20 to 200. Between 20 and 200, that's biologically, that's the amount of people that we can know. And that's just a biological fact. So he builds his theory off of that. He says that was where we were stuck, right? We could cooperate with maybe 100 people. You can cooperate with 100 people. But then when it gets more than that, you need technologies, right? So even think about like a synagogue service. You have 30, 40 people in the room, then it's fine. But if you have 500 people in the room, like a high holidays, I need to stand a little higher. I need a microphone. I need everyone to have a book so they could focus on the book, right? Without those technologies, how am I going to connect with 500, 600 people? Right? So, and most importantly, the way that I can connect with those 500, 600 people is by telling a story, which we do through the holiday, which we do through the Torah reading, which I hopefully do to some extent in the sermon, right? So, so all those, so that's the, ignore her. That's the technology, right? That's the technology that we can, that's what he's talking about, the ability to tell a story, and that makes us leap beyond the between 20 and 200 people. What enabled different bands, right here, about 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens bands began displaying an unprecedented capacity to cooperate with one another, as evidenced by the emergence of interband trade and artistic traditions, and by the rapid spread of our species from our African homeland to the entire globe. What enabled different bands to cooperate is that evolutionary changes in brain structure and linguistic abilities apparently gave sapiens the aptitude to tell and believe fictional stories and to be deeply moved by them. Right? So it's not that I can remember 900 names, right? Only Joe can do that, right? But what I can do is I can tell a story. And that's the leap, right, that he's saying, that instead of building a network from human to human chain alone, right, he's using sort of IT talk there. So what's the chain? It's not just human to human, but rather it's which is what Neanderthals did. What Homo sapiens were able to do is a new type of chain, a human to story. And then other humans relate to the story. And that's what's able to relate people and establish the network. In order to cooperate, sapiens no longer had to know each other personally, they just had to know the same story. And that's the key. Right? So when people get wrapped up, right, in following a leader, a politician, they don't have to have personally met the politician, even though every politician will tell you the way you get elected is by going door to door, right? And that's true on a local level. But once you move, like even beyond the local level, someone is running for national office, right? Of the hundreds of millions of people that vote in an American election, they will not have met the candidates. But the two candidates are telling two stories. Which story do they connect with? And that's the key. Yeah, Nadine. Yeah. Right.
facts and support his arguments as opposed to the notion of belief.
Right. So my objection to Harari on religion is not, yes, he does understand, I agree with him, that the Bible is a story. I think he is stuck in having the perception that the Bible is a story for people who believe it literally, and therefore it's dangerous. And I think he doesn't understand that there are many ways to use the Bible. And basically, and we'll get to this later, but I'll just give you like a teaser. His point, he says, for stories to be responsible, they have to be able to self-correct to stay current. And he says the problem with the Bible is it doesn't self-correct. It can't evolve. And that's a total misunderstanding of the history of religion. All religions evolve like all stories evolve. And he's not able to see that. So, and I'll show you there how he does that. And it's not just in Judaism, it's in Christianity also. Yeah.
On a separate occasion, not in this book, he stated that we all decide what and who we're going to trust. So basically, it just goes back to, some people are able to trust this information and some people do not trust that information.
Yeah.
So it's basically, he's kind of previously argued against, what he just said.
Right, he is. And I think that also, if you understand that something is a story, you can know that it's not literally true, but it can still inspire you as a story. Like, okay, for example, the famous myth, right? George Washington cuts down a cherry tree, right? So when I was younger and struggling with the idea of how do we, why should we be religiously committed Jews if we do not believe that everything in the Bible is literally accurate? So my father always explained to me using that story, like, it doesn't matter whether George Washington actually cut down a cherry tree. It doesn't matter whether it happened or not. What's important is that it teaches that the founder of the country, the first president, was an honest person, and that the value of honesty was a part of his personality that he applied to his engagement with the foundation of the Republic, right? And that's a truth, and that's a value truth, and that's something that connects us as a community of Americans. And it's not dependent on the historical veracity of whether or not he actually cut down a cherry tree and had to deal with his father upset what happened to my cherry tree. So that's so it's a way of thinking, about it there, and he understands that, but I don't see him applying that to religious story. So he starts talking about religious stories, and we'll just finish section here. It's on page 23 when he talks about Christianity here, and he has this whole story about, a section about the extreme example of stories is Jesus. Page 22. 2 millennia of storytelling have encased Jesus within a thick cocoon of stories that it is impossible to recover the historical person. For millions of devout Christians, merely raising the possibility that the real person was different from the story is blasphemy, but not for all Christians. So he's focusing on the literalism, on the fundamentalism in his engagement with Christianity. And then he just to continue on, I'll jump a bit. He says, interestingly, while most Christians were not physically present at the Last Supper, they have heard the story so many times, they have been seen so many images of the event that they remember it more vividly than they remember most of the family dinners in which they actually participated, which is great, right? And there is understanding, right? There's the sense of incorporation of the story, right? I don't remember who sat where at Thanksgiving dinner, but I remember the order of the table at the Last Supper, right? And then, interestingly, Jesus' Last Supper was the Jewish Passover meal. Right, so here he's talking about Judaism and Christianity together, which according to the gospel accounts, Jesus shared with his disciples just before his crucifixion. In Jewish tradition, the whole purpose of the Passover meal is to create and reenact artificial memories. Just great line, right? Every year, Jewish families sit together on the eve of Passover, eat and reminisce about their exodus from Egypt. They are supposed to not only to tell the story of how the descendants of Jacob escaped slavery in Egypt, but to remember how they personally suffered at the hands of the Egyptians, how they personally saw the sea part, and how they personally received the 10 Commandments from God, at Mount Sinai. And it's true. And then he's going to quote from the passage in the Haggadah. He says the Jewish tradition doesn't mince words here. The text of the Passover ritual, the Haggadah, insists that in every generation a person is obligated to regard himself as if he personally had come out of Egypt. If anyone objects that this is a fiction and that they didn't personally come out of Egypt, Jewish sages have a ready answer. They claim the souls of all Jews throughout history were created by God long before they were born, and all these souls were present at Mount Sinai. I don't think that's the right answer to that problem. I think the point is that we perceive ourselves as being in the Exodus because we connect that story at ours. It doesn't mean that I have to believe that my soul was there so that I actually am remembering it in the recesses of my pre-reincarnated history. And by quoting something like that, again, that's the, I think, where he's showing his limited understanding of the sophistication, and that's an extraordinarily sophisticated aspect of the Haggadah ritual. Because when we say we're personally there, we're not personally there, right? But we recall the history as if we were, and by understanding that, it also means that we don't have to be dependent on the historicity of the account, because we're remembering it as if. And it's the as if which is the connection that I understand. This is a story, and it's a great story. And it connects me to who I am, to my identity. And that's that last leap he's not, saying, and I'll just read you the last paragraph here. So every year in the most important celebration of the Jewish calendar, millions of Jews put on a show that they remember things that they didn't witness and that probably never happened at all. As numerous modern studies indicate, repeatedly retelling a fake memory eventually